Welcome to our new plot of land in London. We got this last August 2022, but we actually started doing something in January 2023. And in about 3 months, we transformed this whole area. We had weeds as tall as my chest. We managed to remove them completely, make raised beds, a polytunnel, different structures. And I'm gonna show you around after a wet July, so you can see what we're harvesting, the techniques that we used, but also a few issues that we are having with the plants. This is our pathway, and it's the main entrance to the plot. And as you can see, there are loads of different flowers and plants, because the main idea behind this was to have a welcoming area for insects, pollinators and wildlife to access the plot, because it's not only about growing food, but it's about creating an ecosystem, and we achieved that by adding this biodiversity of loads of different plants and flowers. But also, some of the flowers are edible, medicinal, or decorative. Like the sunflowers that we have along the border, we use them in the kitchen to make sunflower oil, but we also leave some sunflower heads to attract wild birds so they can feed on the seeds, but it's also a natural pest control for the area. And we used old logs and woods that we found around here to create the borders and add a touch of beauty to this main pathway leading into the plot. In this area of the plot, we created 2 raised beds using old timber that we found here. On this side, we got beans growing on a vertical structure that we made with bamboo in a sort of teepee style. And the reason is that we can still grow plants underneath. We got 2 massive borage plants growing in both ends of this raised bed. Borage is an edible flower, and you can use the leaves to make a medicinal tincture. And in between there are also courgettes, onions and other plants. But what we keep doing is mulching hard the ground, because it improves fertility, but also the structure. As it's the first year of the plot, we are trying to repel weeds by adding layers and layers of mulch, particularly wood chips and straw. Straw because we can inoculate it with mushrooms and have an extra production of food in between our plants. And wood chips because it takes a long time to decompose and it adds fertility. And here we got corn, different varieties that we planted in this raised bed. I started planting beans at the base when they were roughly half a meter tall, because the beans can use the stalk of the corn to climb up, and they're also companion plants. And hopefully we will have a nice production of food here with some extra flowers planted at the beginning of the raised bed to encourage more pollinators to pollinate our main crops. This border of the garden is almost entirely dedicated to flowers that we can use in the kitchen. Like poppies, we leave the entire plant to dry, and then we can harvest the seeds to either use them in the garden for next year or in the kitchen for different recipes, but also a variety of different flowers to attract again pollinators, which is a natural pest control for our plot, like cornflower, geraniums, yarrow. And the entire border is made using old bricks that were already here. We also have an old rosemary plant that produces a great amount of herbs for our kitchen, and a rose hip that hopefully soon will produce fruit that we can use for tea. An horseradish plant that unfortunately self-seeded in the middle of the pathway. Hopefully soon we can harvest it and remove it, even if it's really hard to remove it entirely. And a small raised bed that we created again with bricks, with massive cabbages that soon we will pick and ferment, and a teepee to host some beans to grow vertically. Where we are right now, it was probably the first area that we created at the allotment. If you remember from one of my previous videos that I will link up here, we removed all the weeds, placed cardboard, topped with wood chips, and started placing the metal raised beds. And we used a no-dig style combined with hugel culture. Hugel culture means basically stratifying different layers of a mix of materials like logs, twigs, straw and compost to save money but also to add fertility to the ground. And in front of me we planted 2 or 3 different varieties of potatoes, different colors, even if I'm not a fan because they look great but the harvest is not good most of the times. I prefer varieties like Charlotte, normal potatoes. And then behind me we have a raised bed that didn't really work out because we used a different kind of compost and the tomatoes are not thriving as they should, even if we are still picking some harvest. On this side we have loads of different heirloom varieties of tomatoes. With carrots at the borders and beetroots that we sowed in one of my previous videos and are almost ready to harvest. And in the middle, this was meant to be a spiral for herbs, but we ended up planting a massive dahlia at the center and courgettes that are literally taking over the space. We try to keep on top of the harvest. We are picking courgettes daily, but most of the times we forget and they turn into marrow, and we are donating them to every single neighbor. This is the left-hand side of our plot. And it starts with a 2-bay composting system that it's probably the second thing that we did when we moved here, just because we wanted to make sure to compost all the weeds and plants that we wanted to remove from the ground, to then transform them into nutrient-rich substrate that we can then apply to the plants next year. We have 2 watering tanks to collect water, and I use EM1, which are effective microorganisms, into the water so they slowly release biodiversity of microorganisms that then I can apply to all my plants. The reason why you see everything so healthy, it's because we used a few different techniques. So we used homemade compost to top up a thin layer of every raised bed, but then volcanic rock dust to slowly release minerals into the ground, and copper tools. Copper tools are amazing because we use them since the beginning and they repel slugs and snails. In fact, we didn't see pretty much not even a single one. And at the same time, they release minerals into the ground that are beneficial for the plant. Behind the camera, we got a small raised bed with a few different varieties of peas that are ready to pick. Actually, we keep picking them, but they don't make them home just because we eat them here as a snack. And we have a few left on the plant to dry so we can save the seeds and plant them next year. And in front of me, these 2 raised beds are absolutely packed with plants but bursting with life. We got cabbage that it's growing great and it's protected by a thin net for pigeons. And then we got courgettes, aubergines and chilies interplanted in the same raised bed with cucumbers trailing up. We just did a massive harvest of cucumbers, probably between 20 and 30 kilos, all different varieties that we will pickle, ferment and just preserve for the winter months so we can enjoy fresh harvest even throughout the cold months. And behind me, this polytunnel, we decided to dig roughly half a meter deep to avoid making some sort of shade for the allotment on side of us, but also because we needed soil to top up the raised beds here and at the front. At the front we got corn and courgettes growing and they are really tall now and starting to produce. In here it just smells incredible. It's the marigold, but also the calendula and all these different flowers that we use as a protection for our main crop. And in the middle raised bed, we have 2 or 3 different varieties of melons that are producing. And if the weather gets better, hopefully we will be able to harvest some by the end of the season. A few varieties of tomatoes interplanted with basil and marigolds. They are companion plants that interact between each other, and with this sort of symbiotic relationship they protect each other. And then more cucumbers on that side interplanted with aubergine, but you can also see a few amaranth plants or chard because I had them in my homemade compost and I just left them to self-seed as it's an extra production of food, and if it's in the middle of the way I just remove them. And lastly, here we have this row of runner beans that we planted late intentionally, just because we wanted this succession of cropping and not an harvest all at once, but a constant production of food that we can pick throughout the season and never run out of things to harvest. And you can find more information in my new book, Rebel Gardening, that we released in April, and it contains a breakdown of what we did and how we did it in our backyard and here at the plot, based on almost 10 years of growing food here in London. I hope you enjoyed this tour of the garden, and if so, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next week for another episode. Thank you for watching.